All right. Well, this week we're going to concentrate on the boot process. You have seen this every single time you boot up your laptop. You see it do some kind of spinny dance of some kind, whether you got an Apple, a Linux machine, a Windows machine, whatever. Does not matter at all what you have. Every single bit of hardware goes through some kind of boot process. Oh, that includes your phone as well, or really any other device that you got. The router that you got in the corner of your house providing Wi-Fi to everybody, everything has got some kind of kernel, some kind of boot process. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today ends up in every device. So first things we want to talk about, we've already talked about this before. You've already dealt with these first two terms directly. BIOS. If your laptop is super duper old, this is what you've got. I don't think anybody's got a laptop older than about 10 years old. And around is about 2008, UEFI started coming out, becoming big and bigger and bigger. And we really started to see them crop up on mainstream laptops in around 2012, 2014, somewhere around there. So if you've got a laptop older than that, then yeah, you're definitely on BIOS. Otherwise, you're on the newer UEFI. So BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. When we turned on the virtualization extensions in your Windows laptops, you interacted with either the BIOS or the UEFI, probably the UEFI. But they serve the same purpose. They control whether or not hardware is on, your system clock. Yeah, that's pretty much it, really. Just hardware features, really. CPU features, whether or not your video card turns on, things like that. And UEFI is just the newer version of BIOS. So, I mean, they like I said, they serve the same purpose. But the UEFI has added support for a mouse. So if you've got a fancy UEFI, it's got mouse support. May not be great mouse support, but it's got mouse support, so you can click on things and enable things with your mouse instead of keying around with the arrows on the keyboard and turning things on. UEFI also has better support for multi-boot, which this is an idea that maybe you have Windows on your machine or two different versions of Windows on your machine, or a version of Windows, a version of Linux, and a version of Mac on your machine. Not that I can officially condone installing Mac on a non-Mac hardware, right? Yeah. Anyway, UEFI can handle that a whole lot better than the BIOS did. But either way, that's what they do. They control hardware. Now, Post. This is also part of the BIOS of the UEFI boot process. So POST stands for Power On Self-Test. You may have covered this already in the PC hardware class, but Power On Self-Test basically probes all your hardware on the way up to make sure everything is working before it before it tries to boot. And that is beneficial, right? Because if you know about hardware failure before you actually boot, it saves you a whole lot of troubleshooting time, right? Something like, your RAM has changed. Are you sure? That kind of thing, handled by the UEFI or the BIOS. And it'll just remind you, hey, you probably installed some new RAM. Is that cool? Is that exactly what happened? Because if you see that message without ever having touched your RAM, probably something to do with RAM failure or something like that, right? Anyhow, MBR and GPT. Okay, so the BIOS UEFI, that starts this process of post. Probes all your hardware, controls it all. Once that process is done, it hands off the process to either the master boot record, which exists as the very first few sectors of your hard disk, and the information contained there says, hey, the operating system is located here. So basically, it's a hardware to software transition during boot. GPT, just like UEFI, is MBR Part 2. So GPT really just allows for massive partitions and can, that's pretty much it, really. It just allows for bigger partitions and the idea of UUID that's baked into the actual standard of dealing with partitions. So the GUID, and that's GPT unique identifier. So anyway, every hard drive can be identified by a unique number that looks like, it's like a 64-character hexadecimal value, which is, it is large. Hang on, wait a minute, see if I can find one. Oh man. Let me see, how about this? GUID. Come on, Google, you can do it. There you go, that's a GUID. Wait, click it. There we go. Yeah, so massive numbers. Scary stuff. It looks horrible. It's really not. You don't really ever deal with these things. But when you do deal with these things, just imagine yourself in the situation where you have 17 identical hard drives in sectors, size, speed, and interface. They're all the same. And you do something like a list disks, and you're like, all right, well, which one's which? I only want to pull the bad one from the system. Which one is that? So this can help you identify which one's which. Anyhow, yeah, so MBR, you'll find it a whole lot on Linux systems that like to hang on to old stuff, and Windows systems that are slightly on the old side. So Windows 7 still tended to use MBR for smaller disks. GPT, however, is slowly taking control of absolutely everything. So on newer Linux systems that embrace the newer stuff, and of course Windows 10, you're going to find GPT. That also goes for Mac, since like around 2014-ish, something like that. It's a little after the Intel switch. Anyway, so bootloader. This is the actual software. So I mentioned that Post will hand off to the MBR or GPT. GPT, well, those two things contain the bootloader. And the bootloader is now unique to the system. So everything up to this point was pretty agnostic to the system that was actually running on your computer. The bootloader, however, is unique to the system that it runs with. So if you've got a super duper old machine, right? You got a Windows XP box or a Windows 98 box running in the corner for some crazy reason, you're using NTLDR. So the NT loader kind of has this process where after the MBR, well, it would have been the MBR handoff at that point because GPT didn't exist. The NTLDR would find a file, it's always in the same spot, called boot.ini. That was directly in the C drive. And it contained information like which sector the operating system started on. So it can point the system to that and then actually boot up, right? Because you kind of need System 16 and System 32 files to actually boot everything up. So anyway, that was NTLDR's job. There was an infamous message that you would get, whether it would be from hard disk failure or someone deleted something really, really important or they had a virus or whatever. There was an NTLDR is missing. And if you got that message, the repair utilities and facilities were not really that great back in that time. So that was the universal sign for, hey, guess what? You get to reinstall Windows. Yay. So NTLDR is missing. If you ever see that on a machine, I am sorry. Luckily, though, most everybody's running on Windows 7, which no longer uses NTLDR. They use Boot Manager. Yay, because Boot Manager supported GPT and UEFI. So Boot Manager started up with Windows Vista, which was around 2004. Windows 7 came out in what, 2001? Something like that. And then Vista came out a little bit prior to that. You know what? I don't know that for sure. So Windows Vista release date. When was that? Oh, 2006. Wow. So 7 was after that. So that was 2009. Wow, my timeline's way off. So in around 2006, we started to see support for all that. What's that? Yeah, Windows XP must have been 2001. Yeah, I think that might be what I'm thinking. Let's see. Windows XP. 1999. Oh, it said it. 2001, yeah. Okay, so my timeline is right, but for the wrong operating system. Cool. All right, so Boot Manager, we started to see that in about 2006. And the cool thing about that is that, yeah, big, massive hard drives you could start using. Not that they were really prevalent back then in 2006. But, yeah, you could start seeing a whole lot of things come up and supported. And we still use Boot Manager today. So you no longer see NTLDR is missing. You see Boot Manager is missing. Oh no! But the repair facilities are actually pretty good now. So you just pop in a Windows 7, 8, 10 flash drive and start the repair process. It'll figure it out and actually replace and build everything again. There's some manual things that we can do to facilitate that, but to be honest with you, it's not that necessary anymore. But I will say Windows has, for the longest time, been the butt of a lot of repair jokes, such that you'll get those memes where it's like Windows repair, and all it really does is just wait for 30 seconds and then come back and tell you that it didn't find any problems or whatever when you know there's a problem. But either way. Anyhow, so on the Mac side, for up until about 2008, it was during the Intel switch. So I think it was somewhere between 2008 2012, somewhere in there. BootX was the prominent way to boot a Mac system. So you know that Apple logo and the spinny little lines that happen over and over and over and over again until you actually start booting? That was BootX. So BootX doesn't actually have kind of a similar feature set that we are familiar with on both Windows and Linux machines. So you had open firmware that took care of all of the boot, which served as the BIOS, the UEFI, dealt with the MBR and GPT all in one go, and then handed off directly to BootX. So because Apple can control the hardware stack, they don't have to have as many steps. They know what they're dealing with, so they just hand straight off to BootX. But this was superseded by Boot EFI around that Intel switch, and now it's basically open firmware is what does the power on self-test and all the other probing, and then hands off to boot.efi, which is obviously the UEFI counterpart. Anyway, so boot EFI takes care of the rest of it and loads up your operating system. So used to be BootX, now it is boot EFI. So in Linux, same basic deal though. Your BIOS or UEFI, and then post, and then hand off to an MBR GPT partition, and then from there you find I've got eLilo down there, but nobody uses it. You actually have to go out of your way to try and use eLilo. It's just there because it shows up a lot, and it still shows up on the Linux Plus test that we'll study for next semester. But Grub is the big one, version 2 specifically. The way that it works is that works kind of the same way, right? In older versions, you are going to find a boot.image or core.image on the disk, and that would live in /boot/grub. Now, there is a /boot/grub/EFI, I believe, where all of the EFI stuff is stored. So there wasn't really a change. So there's no NTLDR to boot manager kind of change or anything like that. It was just grub, and that supported MBR booting, and then Grub 2 supports MBR booting and UEFI booting, or GPT booting. So either way, it's Grub all the way down. eLilo, so Lilo dealt with MBR booting, and then eLilo, EFI, Linux loader, is what takes over at this point. But again, anything Lilo is pretty niche. I really doubt it's ever going to come up. If you ever find yourself standing in front of a Linux machine and that Linux machine is less than 10 years old, you're not going to see Lilo most likely. Anyway, at least if you do find one of those computers, you can nod your head and go, I know this acronym. Anyhow, we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago where we were getting in and swapping out your virtualization toggle, I guess. We enabled virtualization in your machine. You got there this way. If you are running on really, really old hardware, or you've turned off fast boot and you're booting in Linux, it might be beneficial that you know there is a key to press during boot. That key is different depending on the manufacturer. There's no way to know without looking at the manual. Or I've dealt with 100 Lenovo's, or I've dealt with 100 Dells, and I've memorized the key that is, right? So it can be delete, F2, F12, F1, F10. It can be the enter key. On my current Lenovo, it is enter. Huh. I've never seen that before, but until I bought that Lenovo. So anyway, on Macs, for the love of God, don't do this. But you can. During the boot, if you press Command, Option, 0, and the F key. I don't know what it is about Mac, but they love their 8-key combos to get to anything. I mean, I guess it prevents you from accidentally doing stuff, I guess. But either way, it's kind of funny. Either way, Command Option 0 and F will drop you into Open Firmware, which is a big old terminal that doesn't have a whole lot of capability. But if you're curious to see what you can do in Open Firmware, it's stuff like this. So you can actually change some of the same options that you are able to change in a more traditional BIOS. But Mac just turns on all the features. So unless you're trying to turn off a feature, there's really no need to come in here and change anything. Anyway, if you're if you're a little masochistic, you can devour that book. But it's an older book, so probably things have changed. But to be honest with you, there's not a whole lot of need to get in there. I can summarize this in both Windows 8 and Windows 10 by saying, press the Start menu and search for Recovery. Hit Recovery Options, and click Restart Now in Advanced Startup. That is a summary. This is the actual step-by-step point-and-click way to get to that. And once it reboots, you're going to look for a UEFI firmware button as you go on through. I've got those notes a couple weeks ago. If you need to know how to get into there, I actually have a walkthrough on how to do that. So not a whole lot to see there. So this is more in the PC hardware wheelhouse, but you have to deal with software to get there, so it turns out it kind of splits. Here's the thing. Your motherboard that y'all were talking about just earlier today needs updates. Did y'all talk about that at all? You did. All right, so you talked about flashing the BIOS or firmware or something like that, maybe? Maybe not? All right, so you need to update your BIOS or UEFI. The way that you do this is different between manufacturers. If you've built your machine and you've got an Asus motherboard or an MSI motherboard or a Gigabyte motherboard or an ASRock motherboard, whatever they are, you need to go to their website. They will give you a .rom file or some kind of facility to update your motherboard. If you spent lots of money on your motherboard, they give you software. You just press go and it takes care of everything. If you spent a little bit less, you put something on a flash drive, boot into that flash drive. There's a key combo that you do for your motherboard, and it's something, I think my MSI motherboard says something like Easy Flash or whatever. You just press F11 to boot into Easy Flash, and it's like, where's your flash drive? You point it there and find boot ROM, and it just takes care of it from there. On Dell's, HP's, Lenovo's, they have a software. You download the thing, you double-click on the thing, and it takes care of the thing, and you reboot. Easy peasy. The one commonality between all of the different ways to update your firmware is never, ever interrupt that process. Don't do it. Don't do it. Firmware is called that because it lives in this in the no man's land between hardware and software, right? It's not hard, it's not soft, it's firm, right? So, firmware. There is a chip that stores firmware. It is in read-only mode. That means you can't make changes to it except for when you are updating your firmware. It unlocks that ROM, makes it writable. You write that firmware, and then it locks it again. That way, that software can't actually change. But if you get halfway through the process of writing your firmware, and you, forget to plug in your laptop and the battery dies during that process, or you kick the plug out of the back of your PC or whatever the deal is, that firmware doesn't get fully written, right? I mean, it was in the process. A lot of times, those ROMs only contain enough memory to store one firmware. One. So, if you get halfway through writing your firmware, there's no other firmware. And that firmware also contains the utility to update the firmware. How recursive. Little Inception style, right? So, yeah, if you break your firmware, you probably won't be able to update your firmware. And without firmware, you don't boot. So, yeah. UEFI, right? That's firmware. That's actually your firmware. Your BIOS is firmware. So if you bork your BIOS or your UEFI, you're up a creek. Now, a lot of times there are some recovery facilities that you can use to actually back up and restore and all that kind of thing. And if you buy fancy motherboards, they have something called dual BIOS, where it takes the current BIOS, writes it to the secondary BIOS, and then updates your primary BIOS, right? That way, if you actually bork anything, you have a backup. It'll fail down to the secondary BIOS and boot from that. And then you can try again if you need to. I imagine it's really, really hard to bork those motherboards, but there's someone in existence today that has done it. I promise. Every problem that you're experiencing, whatever you go through in IT, someone's already gone through it. I promise. It's just the way of IT. The bright side of that is that someone's probably already complained about it and quite possibly already fixed it. And if they're cool enough, they might have written about it on the internet, so you can fix your problem too. All right, now we get to actually the meat of all of this. Y'all have played with the BIOS a little bit before, so I didn't go into that. But we hadn't really played with boot logs. So in Windows, there is a little utility called the System Configuration Utility, aptly named MSConfig, short for Microsoft System Configuration Utility, right? And inside of here, you can come in, choose boot, and boot log. So Windows by default doesn't log what happens during boot. It goes through it, obviously, but it doesn't write it anywhere. So because of that, if your boot ever fails, there's really no way to figure out what failed. The event log doesn't actually start logging until after Windows is loaded. So yeah, you're kind of up a creek if you die during boot. Now, the repair facility does work pretty well. The recovery does work pretty well, so there's a lot of things that just get fixed automatically if you just pop in a flash drive and click fix this thing. But in the off chance that doesn't work and you can't really afford reinstalling Windows, boot logs will help a lot. So that's how you do it. You come in here, you hit the boot tab, click boot log, click apply, and you're done. Anytime you change anything in this configuration utility, it will, after you click OK, remind you to reboot, because nothing that you change in that box happens until after you reboot. So, right, I'm already booted. What's there to log? Nothing. So it's not until I reboot that it actually starts logging. Now, once you start logging, a file called ntbtlog.txt is created. So NT stands for new technology. Funny enough, new technology didn't exist until 2001. How new? BT short for boot, and log obviously for a log. .txt just means, or TXT just means that it's a text file and will open up automatically in Notepad. So to get there, open up, let me just see, let's open up one of these bad boys. Go to this PC, C drive, and I believe ntbtlog is hidden by default. So this is where you'll want to come, the C drive, hit view, and check the hidden files box. And hidden files will be shown up, and ntbtlog will show up down here somewhere. Double click on it, and you'll get to see everything that has happened. And it'll just keep logging and logging and logging and logging. So, like, if you're not careful, you probably will end up with a huge megabytes large text file after a couple of years. Yeah, and I mean, it's text, so not that big a deal. All right. So, in Linux, here's what we're going to do. I actually want to show this to you. So, I'm going to boot. Oh, you know what? Here's what we'll do. I will boot Linux in live mode, and I will kind of explain what that is, because I guarantee you there's going to be someone in here that's like, I totally installed it, and you didn't. Because Linux is kind of cool. It's got a feature called Live. And by the way, when you're creating your VM, it is going to be Linux Mint, and it is a derivative of Ubuntu. So it will choose that automatically if you spell that right. But if you want to call it, you know, Peggy Sue, I don't know what you like to call your VMs, maybe not. Come in here, Linux, Ubuntu. Give it a couple gigs of RAM. Now, these are not to scale, I do not know because I'm not looking at it what I ask you to set up, but this is probably pretty close. However, just choose the minimums, at least the minimums on that. All right, so to boot Linux Mint, start that bad boy up, add your image. I've got this on a flash drive, so if you guys want, I'll pass this around after I'm done, but Linux 19.3. That says mate. It is pronounced mate. I will call it mate because it's mate. Anyhow, click on that, choose, and start. Remember, if you forget, you'll get that fatal no bootable medium, whatever. Remember to just come in here, right click on the CD, and then go find the ISO at that point. It'll automatically boot if you just leave it alone, but I'm an impatient kind of guy, so I smacked enter, and the default is just to start it up. So the cool thing about a lot of the mainstream distributions of Linux that you get is, as I mentioned before, they have a live mode. What that means is you get a fully functional, software and all, internet and all, system that runs directly off the ISO. You do not have to install it just to hop on the internet and download a file and put it on a flash drive. You don't have to fully install to crack open a Word editor, type something out real quick, and then email it. You don't have to fully install to do just any of your normal desktop stuff, log into your my courses or whatever and submit something. You don't have to fully install to do that. However, it'll be a whole lot faster if you do. So Live quite literally runs off of your flash drive if that's where your ISO is, or off of your hard drive in a VM if that's where your ISO is. So it will be pretty quick, but it won't be SSD quick. So if you actually want to use a Linux distro, install it. But if you just want to test it, Live is what you want to do. So I promise, once you get it installed, it'll boot up a whole lot faster than this. But since we're running off of a flash drive that is, for some reason, slower than before, it's taken a little bit. Even the slowest hard drives can transfer at about 60 to 80 megabytes per second. My flash drive can transfer at about 30 megabytes per second. So even a standard hard drive will be slightly more than 2 times faster than what you're looking at right here. So this is live. You know it's live, and I really, really need you guys to pay attention to this, what I'm about to say. You know it's live because this. Install Linux Mint. It won't give you that option if you've installed Linux Mint, right? It doesn't just let you reinstall over your current install unless you're booted off of live. So if you see this icon, do not submit that screenshot. Don't do it. You might be tempted to. You might forget what I say. Just look at that. You see the icon up there? Don't submit it. It'll be wrong, I promise. So, what I wanted to show you before I go through the install is dmessage. So dmessage. This, during the boot, was the log. Everything. This is the kernel. So, no, I take that back. That is not it. Well, actually, no, it is. It's under Casper VM Linux. So, this is the kernel that lives on the ISO that you get with any Linux distribution that you download. So everything will go through something like this. And then you can see these are the types of CPUs that the kernel supports. And then it goes through detection. So it starts trying to figure out what kind of hardware I've got, negotiating the type of drivers, the type of power states I can deal with, how fast my CPU is, how much memory I've got. And the Windows boot log will do the same exact stuff. So this is not special to Linux or anything like that. On the left-hand side, you can see how fast it happens. So the whole numbers to the left of the decimal are seconds. So it is past the CPU and basic hardware negotiation and into dealing with PCI cards, right? So this is where it would actually start to deal with your SATA bus, where your hard drives live. It's starting to deal with PCI cards like graphics cards or network cards, things like that. all before 1 second has elapsed. Pretty cool. And then as you go on down, we finally hit unpacking init RAM FS. So this is the point where all of the operating system gets dumped into RAM. Remember, RAM is where the operating system stores things that it's working on in its working memory, right? And then it dumps out what it doesn't need and then continues on. But look, it took almost 26 seconds to dump all of that stuff into RAM. This is the fault of the drive that I'm using. It took that long to read all that stuff and dump it into RAM. RAM is super fast. We're talking gigabytes per second fast. But my flash drive can only do 30 megs. So a lot slower. Yeah, I won't go into the math because I'll be wrong. But a lot slower. And then it just continues on, opening up all the different stuff. And you'll see errors like this every now and then. Failed to send host log message. So there's a log message that's actually missing here. And that's probably because we can't write to the hard drive. And then et cetera, figures everything out. And down at the bottom, you're like, hey, I've noticed that I'm a guest in VirtualBox. So I'm going to load up some drivers to deal with that. So it's actually a pretty cool process. And it took about 70 seconds to do a full boot. So yeah, I was sitting there for about a minute, give or take. And then look, yay! At least on IPv6. So I know it's not much consolation or anything like that, but IPv6 does show up on kernel boot log messages, and it took about 70 seconds for my network to be up. So even if it dropped me to the desktop, I wouldn't be able to do anything on the internet. But that's boot logging. So if you just type dmessage, you get all that information. The cool thing about that is that when you type dmessage, it color codes it for you. Yay. If you just go look, so dmessage is really just a fancy front end for looking at a text file. So you can type in cat, which basically just dumps out the contents of a text file. It's all it really does. Fancy Latin word called catenate that does exactly that, just dumps out text. Var log dmessage dot log. So the way this works is I'm saying dump out the text from inside the var directory, inside the log directory, a file called dmessage.log. We need to enter. Oh, it doesn't exist. Ooh. So that means it's stored somewhere different in live. Interesting. Well, we can either we might be able to see some fun stuff in kernel.log though, but I don't own it. So let's see what happens. Yeah, oh, there it is. It's not dmessage.log, at least for now. Let's see what happens after I install it. But kern.log. So dmessage is kernel logs. So maybe in the newer versions of Ubuntu, we just call it something different. So I'll write that down as well. You may also find the file in var log kern.log. Cool. Learn something new every day. All right. Now Mac. Now our heritage shows. Mac and Linux are way more similar than they are different. Turns out the way you get it in Mac is the same way you get it in Linux. So just type dmessage and you get the same messages. Open up a terminal. What is that? Command Shift U. Command Shift U to get to utilities. Open up terminal. Type in dmessage. You'll get those same messages. Pretty cool stuff. Anyhow, that was the big thing. However, the lab. Let's cover that real quick. I've done a little bit of this for you already. Here's the link to the ISO that I need you to get. Here is VirtualBox if for some reason you haven't installed it yet. And what I need you to do is take some screenshots after you've installed, or let me see. Yeah, when your virtual machine is complete. So after the install, after you are done, take a screenshot of Linux Mint running. So if you take a screenshot and it says install Linux Mint, I'll know you haven't installed Linux Mint. So make sure you install Linux Mint. So double click on that thing. Be patient, takes a little while. Especially if you're on a slow internet connection. It does try to download updates while you're installing, so you don't have to install them after the fact. And while it's not exactly the same, you go through the same process as you would with Windows, right? The very first question that Windows installation asked you last week was, what language do you speak? English. Or I don't know, maybe you speak Spanish, Japanese, I don't know, whatever. Polish, who knows? Take your pick. Linux is actually very friendly when it comes to multiple languages. So if you read or write in a different language, that's cool. They probably support it. Keyboard layout, same. Next question. English, English, English. Unless you imported your keyboard from the UK, you're running on that. Installing third-party software is always a good idea, especially because VirtualBox stuff is proprietary, and this will load it up for you. So this, long story short, basically means it'll run slightly faster if you check that box. Now, this window tends to take a little bit, because what it's doing, when you check that box, you're basically asking the installer to probe all your hardware and figure out whether or not you're running any proprietary hardware that would need proprietary firmware or software. And if you are, it will load it up. So this will take just a little bit. Shouldn't take, well, if you're sitting here for more than like 5 minutes, then you're probably running into issues. Yeah. So, what was that, 20 seconds or so? So give it a minute or two. Otherwise, you might be running into issues. Erase disk and install Linux Mint. So this is not talking about your actual host laptop disk or anything like that. It's the virtual disk that you created for your VM. So there is no, it says warning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no danger in this as long as you're looking at a VirtualBox screen, right? Not on your actual laptop. If you're on your actual laptop, it'll blow everything away. So anyway, hit install now. You don't need to choose any of these. These are a little higher level topics, encryption, so that way if someone steals your laptop, at least they can't get at your data. But, I mean, your laptop's gone, so not so great. LVM allows you to do funky stuff, especially if you're on a desktop, if you're adding in hard drives and you want them to all be one big old hard drive, so you can just dump files and not care about which hard drive's which, you want LVM. So we'll talk about those more once we get into the Linux class. So this, what you're looking at right here, is perfectly fine as the default choice. When you click install now, it's going to say, hey, we're about to change your disk. This is the disk we're talking about, and this is what's going to happen. We're going to create one big old partition. It's going to be formatted as ext4, and yeah, once we're done, that's what it'll look like. Once you do that, you just get to stare at the window as it installs. Oh, wait, no, just kidding. Time zone. Oh, I forgot. You got to create your user. So time zone, we are Chicago for weird reasons. There's no Dallas that I know of anyway. So just choose Chicago. They observe the same daylight savings time as we do. AKA, your clock will always be right. That's what I mean by that. And then fill this out. Yay. You call it whatever you want. I have no restrictions on what you're calling these things. You can call them anything you want to. But do require a password to log in. If you log in automatically, there's some features that you don't get. So do this. Encryption of your home folder. So if you just want to encrypt your home folder and not all the other stuff, you can check that box. But again, a bit of a higher level topic, so we won't bother with it now. Now you get to stare at your screen. So this will take a little while, but if it takes more than 30 minutes, you're probably running into issues here as well. So if you've made it to this point in the video, you could probably skip ahead about 5 minutes at least, and we'll probably be to the install portion. I don't want to pause it because I think that might create some issues. So yeah, if you're watching on YouTube, skip ahead a bit. Awesome. So that Toshiba machine, how's it running? How's it running Ubuntu? I'm curious, Robert. See, but if you skip ahead, you miss the banter. It's not important, but it is fun. for me. Y'all are a captive audience. You can't go anywhere. Well, while we're taking this short break, any questions? So far, so good? What's that? Well, all right, good. If you have questions about your other classes, I can field those before I get out of here for lunch. Yeah. Drinking from a fire hose in that class. Network Plus, I hear. Yeah, I think 4 gigs is... Yeah, 4 gigs is cutting it real close. Even one VM is going to make that thing struggle. How's the desktop perform, though? Because Ubuntu 18.04 is based on GNOME, and an older version of GNOME that they fixed a lot of the issues, but it tended to run slower on older hardware. Is it running all right for you? Outside of the VM thing? Because if it's not, you might want to consider what we're installing now. It's based off Ubuntu, so all of the things that work for Ubuntu will work for Linux Mint, but it's got a slightly lighter weight desktop environment, so kind of the look and feel of it is a little different. And it won't make your laptop struggle near as much trying to render like those fadey effects that GNOME likes to do on Ubuntu 18.04. Okay, cool. If it runs fine without a VM, then you are good. Okay, cool. If anybody else is crazy enough to run Linux, let me know. You'll learn a lot just by having to get it all installed and dealing with a whole different paradigm of how to install software. Linux tends to do the phone approach where you got a store and you just like search audio editing software and, up pops a bunch of different utilities to do that. And you just install it from there. Like so the Windows paradigm is doesn't really exist in Linux. It actually just really started to get popular about a year ago. Everything else was kind of done through repositories like on your phone, but they've been doing it this way since forever. Early 2000s or so. I mean, before phones really ever got their app stores. One other perk, it won't ever reboot without your consent. Mac folks don't have to deal with that, but Windows folks do. Ooh. You defer it, and you defer it, and you defer it, and then it just slaps you in the face. We're almost there. We're almost there. That was pretty much the bulk of it, though. At this point, we should be able to, once it finishes up, we should just be able to reboot and we'll be done. You'll have a nice, neat little Linux Mint install to tinker around with, take your snapshots. But we'll be good at that point. If you're curious, you can click that little arrow and it'll show you what's happening. Not that any of that'll make sense right now, but that is quite literally the log of everything that's going on. So pretty interesting nonetheless. Ooh, downloading updates. So that did actually go pretty quickly. You might not have much trouble downloading then today. Anyway, yeah, I meant to mention, Linux is starting to support a whole lot more mainstream software. So, Spotify, Minecraft, Steam, things like that, all exist on Linux now as well. Almost done. Oh, come on. Just playing with me now. You see it count up too? It was like, retrieving 1 file, retrieving 200 files. Wait a minute. Say it, doing it again. Doing it again. Yep. Just waiting. Hey, there we go. Now we're on to the last bits. Oh, yeah. You make money now. Yay. Yep.
You watch, I get $2 back.
Well, under a certain amount, you get it all back. So I think it's like 18,000. So if you make less than that, you don't pay in. So you get it all
Yeah,
back.
I make way less than that.
Oh, cool. You get it all back.
I work part-time, I work like a few days a week. I get $8.50 an hour.
Yeah, you get it back.
Then I can use it all for our spring break trip we're doing. Which I actually made a reservation and everything.
See, I keep getting too excited too quick. I don't even need the language packs. Let me skip this. If you have the same morbid curiosity I do, language packs are just the different languages that you might speak. You can swap them in the settings menu, and everything is in that language at that point. Which is why I say I don't need them. We're only doing English, man. But fine. We'll be inclusive. Okay, I'm going to say this one more time. The bar is almost to the end. It's got to be over, right? I think this is how often I actually install this stuff. Which would be never. Oh, it did it to me again. It's downloading more. There, finally, yay! So, now that the install's done, click restart now. That should pop out the CD for you, or the ISO, reboot the machine, and boot you directly into your new Linux Mint install. Press enter when it tells you to. And there we go. Log into that bad boy. So there's one thing that you probably won't necessarily get if you're not looking for it on purpose, but that's to change the display size of this little box. Sometimes you are able to come in here and change these options manually like this, but that's usually after you install the VirtualBox Guest Editions, which we won't necessarily cover just yet. So if you want more screen space, what you'll want to do, open the menu, and then there's displays right here. Click on that, and you can change your resolution to something a little bigger. So this is your typical small resolution laptop screen. So if you choose that, that's pretty typical. Everything should fit. So keep that, close that, and that'll do it. Then you get your welcome screen, and you can walk through all of that stuff. I don't need you to go through any of that, but I would recommend doing it just to see how it works, kind of figure out how the system works. In Mac, you get something called Time Machine. Linux Mint has something called Time Shift that serves the same purpose. Driver Manager, Update Manager, System Settings, Software Manager, Firewall, all that kind of fun stuff. And if you want to read a little bit more about it, there's documentation too. Anyway, close that, take a screenshot of that, and that should be your submission. Notice how there's no Install Linux Now button? Yeah. That's the difference. Make sure that it does not exist in your screenshot to me. Otherwise, I will dock a few points. But that's it. So that is the end of the lab. And then obviously take a screenshot of the hardware in VirtualBox. Make sure I can see all that junk right here. Add those two photos to a document. Save it as PDF. Send it to me. And that'll get you all your points. All right. Outside of that, we are done. Y'all have any questions? Yep, I got it. All right. Well, I'll close it out here.